This story begins with the arrival of the New Zealand Company ship Tory into Whanganui Tawa, modern-day Wellington, on the 20th of September 1839. This ship was met by two chiefs, Te Whalepore and Te Puni. Over the next week, these two men would lead the negotiations for the sale of what would become Wellington to the New Zealand Company. However, they were not local to the area. Both men were from the Ngāi Te Whiti Hapu of Te Ati Awa, and had only settled in the region in the previous 2 decades after the conquests under the leadership of Te Raupraha. Their position in the area was somewhat precarious. Te Ati Awa was divided amongst a number of settlements in 1839. There were only a few hundred Te Ati Awa living around Te Whanganui Tawa, alongside a larger number of people from other iwi. Most likely Te Puni and Te Whalepore wanted to sell the land at Wellington to allow them to capitalise on the temporary dominance of the area and secure an alliance with the Pākehā settlers that would arrive shortly. Not to mention that the 120 muskets and gunpowder that they received as payment would prove useful in a potential future conflict. It also seems unlikely that they fully understood what the New Zealand Company expected of them. Edward Jenningham Wakefield, one of the representatives of the company, quoted Te Whalepore a few months later saying, "I thought you would have 9 or 10. I thought that I could get one placed at each pa, as a white man to barter with the people and keep us well supplied with arms and clothing, and that I should be able to keep these white men under my hand and regulate their trade myself. But I see that each ship holds 200, and I believe now that you have more coming. They are well armed, and they are strong of heart, for they have begun to build their houses without talking." Wakefield explained this by saying that their minds had evidently not been of sufficient capacity to realise the idea of such number. However, both Te Puni and Te Whalepore had visited Sydney in the late 1820s, and so had a good idea of what a European colonial settlement would look like. Regardless, they told the New Zealand Company representatives that there were other Te Ati Awa who would be willing to sign similar agreements. As I said, Te Ati Awa were a geographically divided people. Besides the couple of hundred living at Whanganui Tawa, there were larger settlements at Waiganai on the Kapiti coast, and around Queen Charlotte's Sound at the top of the South Island. Te Ati Awa were traditionally from North Taranaki, around modern New Plymouth. However, due to large and repeated raids from the Waikato, there were very few people remaining in that area. The final concentration of Te Ati Awa were those that had been taken to the Waikato as slaves. However, they were gradually being released as Christianity spread amongst the Waikato people. The New Zealand Company first sailed to Waikanai. However, on the way they stopped at Kapiti to talk to Te Raupraha and Ngāti Toa. They arrived at a significant moment. That morning, the tense peace that had existed for 5 years between Te Ati Awa and Ngāti Raukawa had turned into open battle. These two iwi had lived neighbouring each other at Waikanai and Otaki for the past 4 years, thanks to a peace maintained by Te Raupraha's sister Waitoha. However, she had died a few months previously, and at her tangi, both iwi had asserted their claims to the other's land. This was followed by Ngāti Raukawa murdering some members of a Te Ati Awa ally, and war between those two iwi became inevitable. The morning that the Tory arrived, Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Toa had planned a pincer attack on Te Ati Awa. Te Raupraha, though most commonly associated with Ngāti Toa, was also a senior chief of Ngāti Raukawa, and planned to land a force of Ngāti Toa warriors to the south of Waikanai, while Ngāti Raukawa force attacked them from the north. However, the Ngāti Raukawa attack was routed with a loss of about 50 warriors. Te Ati Awa pursued them back to the stream marking the boundary between the two iwi. Ngāti Toa, seeing their allies run from the battle, decided to get back on their waka and return to Kapiti. When Te Raupraha returned, the Tory and the representatives of the New Zealand Company were waiting for him. They had negotiated for 3 days before convincing Ngāti Toa to sign a land sale. The Tory then sailed over to Waikanai, where they found Te Ati Awa in a disturbed state. As I said, they were at war with Ngāti Raukawa to their north and Ngāti Toa on Kapiti Island, and while they had beaten Ngāti Raukawa, they were afraid that if the two iwi were able to unite, they might be able to overcome Te Ati Awa. However, a strike against either Ngāti Toa or Ngāti Raukawa would leave their villages around Waikanai exposed to attack from the other iwi. So they saw the New Zealand Company's arrival as a blessing. They wished to sell their lands as had happened at Wellington and on Kapiti Island before them, but they only wanted muskets in exchange, lots of muskets and lots of gunpowder. But after the previous 2 agreements, the New Zealand Company agents were short on muskets and could not meet Te Ati Awa's demands. Instead, they took 3 members of Te Ati Awa to Kapiti Island to try and make peace with Ngāti Toa, hoping that peace agreement would make the people of Waikanai less anxious for weapons. At this point, the New Zealand Company's translator left the ship, but the Tory continued on without him. They went south to Queen Charlotte's Sound. On board was Wiramukingi, a chief from Te Ati Awa in Waikanai, who's going to be a very important figure later on in this history. When they arrived at Queen Charlotte's Sound, they found that the people there were busy arming and provisioning themselves to head north to help their relatives on the Kapiti coast. However, they did pause their preparations to negotiate with the New Zealand Company. Some chiefs spoke against the deal, but the New Zealand Company negotiators said that if anybody else spoke against the deal, then they would sail away with all the goods that they had offered in exchange for the land. How much of this was communicated was uncertain. Octavius Hadfield interviewed the whaler brought in as a translator for these negotiations a few years later, and found him unable to explain the concepts required in te reo. Regardless, the Te Ati Awa at Queen Charlotte Sound agreed to sell almost all of the land in New Zealand to the New Zealand Company. Everything from just south of Kawhia to just north of Christchurch was sold in this transaction. Of course, Te Ati Awa had no claim to the vast majority of this land, but the New Zealand Company insisted that this transaction was valid for a few years before giving it up. In February 1840, the Tory eventually headed north and met with the final free group of Te Ati Awa near the site of modern-day New Plymouth. The New Zealand Company had claimed to have already purchased this land at Queen Charlotte Sound, but they entered into negotiations for it with the local people anyway. The boundaries of the land in this transaction were not defined, but it was later said to encompass almost the entirety of Te Ati Awa land in Taranaki, as well as much of the land of neighbouring Taranaki, Ngāti Mutanga and Ngāti Tama iwi. The signatories of the sale were largely from the hapu of Ngā Motu and Ngāi Te Whiti of Te Ati Awa, with a number of hapu not being represented at all, and therefore the sale could not be representative of the entire iwi. This agreement was made after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, and so was actually in violation of the preemption clause of the treaty. After the signing of the treaty, the government had to act as a middleman between Maori interested in selling the land and Europeans wishing to purchase it. This was officially to protect Maori from being exploited by Europeans, however it was also to ensure that the government could charge a premium for being the middleman in this transaction. In the end though, the Ngā Motu sale, as the North Taranaki Agreement was known, was treated the same as any pre-1840 sale. That is, that the governor appointed a commissioner to investigate it and draw up a fair agreement based on the value of goods exchanged for the land. The government decided that a fair rate for land purchased in 1839 was around 6 shillings of goods per acre. However, the New Zealand Company got special treatment. They got land at a rate of 5 shillings per acre, and they were granted land equal to the total money spent on colonisation, not just the value of the goods exchanged. In January 1841, William Spain was appointed as the commissioner to investigate the New Zealand Company's claims. He took a few months to get started and worked his way up from the Cook Strait region to Taranaki. He only started investigating the Ngā Motu agreement in 1844, but the uncertain nature of the company's claim to the land did not prevent settlers from arriving and setting up the town of New Plymouth. By 1843 there were 1,000 Europeans in the settlement, and they were expanding outward, surveying the land and dividing it up amongst themselves. However, the local Maori resisted the settlers, both passively and actively. Settlers were intimidated and driven back to New Plymouth, while on one occasion more than 100 people sat down and blocked a surveyor's progress. The local people were not the only ones angered by the settlement. Waikato and Ngāti Maniapoto claimed rights to the area as a result of their attacks in the 1820s and 30s. A large Waikato party moved into the area near Waitara, east of New Plymouth, and began planting crops in order to assert their rights to the sold land. Shortly afterwards, an armed party of Ngāti Maniapoto went to New Plymouth. The settlers felt intimidated, but Ngāti Maniapoto left after Te Ati Awa held a feast for them and the settlers gave them gifts. In 1842, Governor Hobson made an agreement with Potato Te Wherewhero of Waikato, giving him £150, 2 horses and 100 blankets in exchange for Waikato's claim in Taranaki. Ngāti Maniapoto, however, continued to assert their rights in Taranaki, including sending people to participate in the sit-down protest to block the surveying of the land. Because of these tensions, when Spain finally did arrive to investigate the ownership of the land, it was eagerly awaited. His inquiry had to be held outdoors because around 300 people, both European and Maori, wanted to be present in the audience to listen to the evidence. However, after the hearings he made a decision that shocked Maori. He found that the sale had been largely legitimate, and he recommended that the New Zealand Company receive 60,500 acres of land in North Taranaki, including all of Te Ati Awa's land. Their response was immediate, with around 50 Te Ati Awa, led by Te Waitili Katatore of the Puketapu Hapu, arming themselves to drive the Europeans off their land by force. Meanwhile, Wiremu Kingi down in Waikanae wrote to the new Governor Fitzroy of the injustice of this decision. His hapu's land at Waitara had been sold along with the rest of the iwi's land, but not a single member of his hapu had received payment. Fitzroy himself went to New Plymouth and addressed the Maori. He had made it clear that he would not accept Spain's recommendations. In fact, he started a second investigation led by Donald Maclean. However, he would also not let the Europeans be driven out of the country. If any harm were to come to them, he would send soldiers to keep the peace. He would make sure that the land given to Europeans was a fair amount, and that the Maori that had lived there received payment and were willing to make the exchange, with an acknowledgement given to the absentee owners. In response to this speech, a number of the Pākehā settlers armed themselves and prepared to drive the Te Ati Awa off their contested land. However, the sale reached in November 1844 was sufficient to prevent bloodshed. The Europeans were given an area of 3,500 acres immediately around New Plymouth. They had to pay the hapu Naitawhiti £350, giving the sale an abysmal sale rate of 0.2 shillings per acre. Remember that in 1839 the typical rate had been 6 shillings per acre for most Europeans. There was also a promise that this would be the limit of European settlement around New Plymouth. The resolution of the New Zealand Company's claims did not go as peacefully elsewhere in New Zealand. In Nelson, the New Zealand Company attempted to force the government's hand by settling the Wairau Valley before Spain could investigate their claims to own it. Te Rauparaha was adamant that the land had not been sold as part of the Kapiti Island deed in 1839. The disagreement escalated when the New Zealand Company formed a posse to try and arrest Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihaeta, one of his senior followers. After 2 attempts to handcuff Te Rauparaha failed, a musket fired. It was likely an accidental discharge, but the resulting gunfight led to the death of 4 Maori and 13 Europeans. However, one of the Maori dead was Te Rongu, Te Rangihaeta's wife. In response to her killing, Te Rangihaeta had 9 more Pākehā that had been taken prisoner executed. The response amongst the settlers was immediate outrage. However, William Spain and protector of Aborigines George Clark Jr. managed to calm the settlers enough that they were able to go out on a peace mission to speak to Te Rauparaha. Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihaeta had moved to Otaki and their Ngāti Raukawa allies for protection. However, Spain eventually found Te Rauparaha in Waikanae trying to convince Te Ati Awa to join in an attack on Wellington. Te Ati Awa was not keen, and Spain told them that the government intended to continue operating via the legal system rather than military force. Spain then moved on to Otaki, and after 2 meetings convinced Ngāti Raukawa to maintain the peace, at least so long as no move was made against Te Rauparaha and the Land Commission was to continue. Governor Fitzroy came to the region early in 1844, the year after the incident at Wairau, to speak to the matter. To the settlers in Wellington he said, that our countrymen were there the aggressors, that the principal magistrate was acting illegally, that at least 13 of our countrymen fell during the heat of the conflict brought on by the misconduct of those in authority. The British government does and will hold sacred the blood of Her Majesty's subject, if shed in a just cause, but to suppose that injustice will be countenanced and misconduct defended by a British sovereign is a great and dangerous error. Fitzroy then went to speak to the Maori at Otaki and said, the white men were in the wrong. They had no right to survey the land which you said you had not sold until Mr. Spain had finished his inquiry. They had no right to build the houses they did on that land. As they were then first in the wrong, I will not avenge their deaths. However, Spain's decision in Wellington led to further tensions. He recognised that New Zealand Company's claim to own the land was not sound. Te Ati Awa may have agreed, but most of the land sold did not belong to them. However, he said the settlers should keep the land they had settled and tried to force the New Zealand Company to pay Maori compensation for the land taken. The New Zealand Company reluctantly agreed, but not all Maori agreed to take their money. In particular, Ngāti Tama and Ngāti Rangatahi refused to leave their lands in the Hutt Valley. Fearing a repeat of Wairau or a possible attack on Wellington, both sides stayed on the defensive for a time. In 1845 the settlers formed a militia 220 strong that mustered daily and began building fortifications. It was events in Britain that would lead to the end of this state of tension in both Taranaki and Wellington. Governor Fitzroy was known as a humanitarian and was supported in his efforts to maintain peace and treat Maori with fairness by the Secretary of State for the Colonies in Britain. However, the New Zealand Company representatives in Parliament lobbied hard against Fitzroy, and in 1845 he was recalled and replaced with George Grey. Grey did not have the same humanitarian streak as Fitzroy. He was very interested in and respectful of Indigenous cultures. However, in Australia, he had proposed a form of compulsory assimilation in regards to the Aboriginal people. He was not fully successful in his attempt to implement this policy in South Australia, but New Zealand would give him a second chance at his plans. Meanwhile, the colonial office in Britain was changing its attitude to New Zealand. The colony was unprofitable, particularly due to ongoing military expenses, and making the colony profitable was the main concern in London. The instructions given to Grey in December 1845 was to ensure a quick victory in Northland and to secure British rule elsewhere in the colony. In line with this thinking, Grey moved soldiers to Wellington and in February 1846 began a moving against Ngāti Rangatahi. He forced them to abandon their villages, which his soldiers and local settlers then burnt. Ngāti Rangatahi responded by attacking settlers' farms and destroying their property and livestock. The conflict escalated and eventually the first people were killed in April. The settlers were feeling relatively safe, however, and decided to reduce the militia since there were now soldiers protecting them. And after all, the government had been instructed to cut costs. Unfortunately for them, in May parts of Ngāti Toa and Ngāti Hawa Te Rangi arrived to join Ngāti Rangatahi and won a victory over the settlers at Bulcott's farm. In response, the government looked for allies and found a willing one in Te Ati Awa. It will be remembered that Te Ati Awa had initially been very willing to sell to the New Zealand Company in order to ally themselves with the Europeans against their traditional enemies. They saw this conflict as a chance to develop this relationship with the Europeans further. 250 Te Ati Awa in Wellington, under the command of Te Puni and Witako, joined the government's forces, while Willimu Kingi and Waikanai promised to block any further reinforcements coming from Ngāti Hawa Te Rangi or other whanganui iwi. Grey, after listening to the advice from his Te Ati Awa allies, decided to expand the conflict. Te Rauparaha had remained neutral in the fighting and had been supporting efforts to negotiate a peace. However, Te Ati Awa and the settlers had convinced Grey that Te Rauparaha was aiding the Ngāti Toa warriors fighting in the Hutt Valley. Te Rauparaha was therefore arrested in a dawn raid and held without trial on charges of secretly conspiring against the government. The British government turned a blind eye to this. The permanent Undersecretary for the Colonies at the time wrote, "Under what authority the governor holds him in prison without a legal commitment he does not explain, nor, perhaps is it necessary or desirable, very closely to inquire." Te Rangihaeta was well fortified in his power and would not be able to be surprised in the same way. A large force consisting mostly of Te Ati Awa was sent to attack him. However, Te Rangihaeta withdrew from the pa and ended up retreating to the north after a number of skirmishes. Te Rauparaha's arrest had changed the opinion of people on the Kapiti coast. When Te Puni expected Willimu Kingi to join the pursuit of Te Rangihaeta, Kingi refused. The Waikanai Te Ati Awa had been asked to stop reinforcements heading south, but they would not prevent people fleeing north. Ngāti Raukawa maintained their neutrality but allowed Te Rangihaeta to refuge on their land. Te Puni decided that it was unwise to continue the pursuit without local support, and Te Rangihaeta went free. This effectively ended the fighting near Wellington. Ngāti Rangatahi and Ngāti Tama eventually accepted the government's offer of compensation for their land. Now, Te Ati Awa attempted to leverage their role in this conflict and their status as allies of the Pākehā. Willimu Kingi wrote to Donald Maclean, who had just been made protector of the Aborigines. "Son Maclean, greetings. I am thinking fondly of my home at Waitara, the home of my grandparents and elders. Do not listen to what anyone says to you. Promise not to listen to talk. Hele Taonga is a place where Te Rangihaeta's war broke out. Therefore think carefully, son Maclean. All the people love their home at Waitara. Te Rangihaeta's trouble must stop, but we think Te Rangihaeta will persist in fighting us. We fight with the Europeans against Te Rangihaeta. We have finished building our pa, a fighting pa for us against the people of Whanganui, Taupo, Rotorua, Ngāti Maniapoto and Ngāti Maru at Talia." Kingi was saying both what he wanted from this relationship with the Pākehā and what he was providing in return. He wanted to return to his home at Waitara, and presumably also wanted government protection from any Waikato intervention. What he offered was his continued protection of Pākehā settlements against the iwi that were wanting to drive the Pākehā out. However, Grey had different concerns. The British government continued to see the profitability of the New Zealand Company as being the first priority for the governor, and the easiest way for the government to increase revenue was to buy land from Maori and sell it to settlers at a much higher price. In one instance, the government had paid £3 for 5,000 acres, and then on-sold this to settlers at a rate of £2 or £3 per acre. Over time, the instructions Grey was receiving from London were shifting as a result of the pressure of the New Zealand Company. At first he was told to uphold the rights under the Treaty of Waitangi, then to purchase large amounts of land, and finally to support the New Zealand Company in all land disputes. The British government changed in 1847, and a new Secretary for War in the colonies wanted Grey to take all land that was not under cultivation. Grey replied that in the long run, purchasing the land would be cheaper than simply taking it. But because of this pressure, Grey came up with another use for Wilimukingi and the Te Ati Awa around Wellington. He assumed that since they had supported the government against Te Rangiheata to expand settler interests there, that they would also support settler interests in Taranaki. To this end, Te Puni, Wilimukingi and Witako went with the governor to New Plymouth to address their fellow Te Ati Awa. In 1847, the four men travelled on the HMSS Inflexible, the first steamship to arrive in New Plymouth. However, this show of technological superiority was undone when the three chiefs spoke to their people. The local people had been holding the settlers and the government to their promise of no more land purchases around New Plymouth, despite the increasing demand for land from settlers. Grey had hoped that the three men could convince their people to sell the land to the government so it could be on-sold to the settlers. But not one of the three did. The small settlement at New Plymouth was dependent on the local Maori for food, and the prosperity of Te Ati Awa was increasing rapidly as a result. It was also clear that Waikato and Ngāti Maniapoto were no longer inclined to attack the region, and a growing number of Te Ati Awa were living safely and prosperously on their ancestral lands, thanks in large part to the small Pākehā settlement. Upon seeing the situation, all three advised the local people to hold on to their lands. Te Puni and Wilimutako both asserted that since the Fitzroy sale had included their homelands, they were entitled to payment, and eventually both received compensation for the 1844 sale of New Plymouth. Wilimukingi took a different approach. He declared that he and his people at Waikanae would actually return home to Waitara. Governor Grey was infuriated. Not only had his plans to expand the settlement in New Plymouth been blocked, the arrival of Wilimukingi would further complicate the situation in the area. After his arrival, the Maori population would outnumber the Pākehā for the first time since 1841. Grey threatened the assembled Maori that if they did not agree to further sales, then he would recognise Waikato as conquerors of the land and purchase the area off them. Te Ati Awa refused to comply. Grey then offered to pay for Wilimukingi to resettle north of the Waitara River and build a model village for him there, provided he agreed to the sale of all land between the Waitara River and New Plymouth. Kingi responded that he would build a pā where he chose. Grey then finally resorted to threats, saying to his interpreter, "Tell him that I say he is to remain at Waikanae, and that I will now place him under guard, and that if he dares to remove to Waitara without my permission, I will send the war steamer after him and destroy all of his canoes." However, Grey was powerless to arrest Kingi from amongst the gathered Te Ati Awa, and the meeting ended with that threat hanging over the assembled people. Kingi left for Waikanae to prepare his migration home. Grey realised that Kingi's return would probably mean that New Plymouth would not be able to expand for the foreseeable future. He resolved to attempt to purchase as much land as they could over the months before Kingi returned. 3 large sales were pushed through in the end of 1847, increasing the European land in New Plymouth from 3,500 acres to 29,270 acres. Most of this land was to the west of New Plymouth on the land of the Taranaki iwi. However, Donald Maclean did purchase almost 10,000 acres from Te Ati Awa. He did this by using tactics that would later become common in New Zealand. Maclean did not actually investigate who owned the land. After someone offered to sell him some land, he relied on people coming forward to dispute the ownership of this land. This claim of ownership had to be specific to that piece of land, and after the sale offer was made, so that the meeting with Te Puni and others speaking in general terms about the entire iwi's land did not count as a dispute. Also, people who obstructed the attempts at surveying were not considered to be making a claim about ownership of the land. Those 10,000 acres were sold by only 28 people in exchange for £380. While this was happening, Grey continued to make threats against Kingi. he once threatened to confiscate all of Kingi's canoes and longboats at Waikanai to try and prevent him from heading to Waitara. His final attempt to stop Kingi came in March 1848, when, in a reverse of his earlier strategy, he arranged for a party of Taranaki Te Ati Awa to head to Waikanai to talk to Kingi. A man named Ihaya Te Kilikumara led this party and told Kingi that he would begin negotiations with Grey to sell the land at Waitara before Kingi arrived to dispute it. This only strengthened Kingi's resolve, and the next month the migration began. 587 people travelled north, and it would take 7 months for everyone to make their journey with their goods and livestock. While this migration was happening, 2 more land purchases finished on Te Ati Awa's land. The first was a relatively minor affair, selling 100 acres to Witako's brother-in-law. However, the second sale, the Bell Block, would prove very contentious. This land was east of New Plymouth along the coast and was 1,500 very fertile acres belonging to the Puketapu hapu of Te Ati Awa. This hapu was divided on whether to sell or not, as well as how much to sell for. Francis Dillon Bell was the government's negotiator for the sale and was determined to push the sale through in the face of all opposition. He came upon another strategy for getting a purchase agreement. He paid those that were willing to accept his offer immediately an initial payment, and promised them the rest of the money once others agreed to the sale. By this method, he motivated Maori to act as his agents in convincing the rest of the hapu, and effectively set the final price without having to deal with those who wanted a higher payment. Once a sufficient number had agreed, Bell pushed the sale through, and afterwards offered compensation to those that hadn't agreed to sell. As can be expected, this created significant tensions within the hapu, and a number of people refused to accept their compensation until as late as 1852. With Kingi's return, there were no more land purchases for 5 years. However, the government was laying the groundwork for future land sales. Throughout this period, they were paying individuals down payments in exchange for promises that when the time came, they would sell their land.